So, what is your quest? Hadubal asked Imswitch after they had been beating down the path for some time. Don't have one, said Imswitch. Hadubal contemplated this for a while. After a while, she said, Then we have to think of one. Why? Imswitch asked. Gets more interesting that way. Now it was Imswitch's turn to contemplate a while. Humph, he said, presently. The blue mountains in the distance were getting less blue and more detailed. Sometimes lizards skittered away, but mostly it was them, thorny, dusty cacti, and one or two hopeful buzzards circling around. They stopped for water and chugged their bottles greedily. What about yourself? Imswitch asked. My quest is to help you with your quest, Hadubal promptly replied. Cute, Imswitch said. They kept walking. Suggestion 1, Hadubal said, getting the blue mountain up ahead. Well, I'm doing that, but that doesn't count as a quest, Imswitch said. Hadubal raised a furry eyebrow. Seems extremely quest-like to me, she said. Not a quest. Hadubal nodded acceptingly. Suggestion 2, making it big as a stand-up comedian. No. Suggestion 3, helping those people up ahead. What? Up ahead in the clearing sat a man of middle age, a woman of middle age, and a granny with a grey bun tied up on her head. Not a bun you eat, but one of those made of hair. And the middle-aged couple looked dejected. The granny was knitting a sock with gusto. Ho-ho, the granny cried as they approached. The middle-aged couple just waved weakly. Imswitch approached them. Would you like some water? He asked. They did. They really did. They drank deeply and gratefully. Whew! You saved us, breathed the middle-aged man, whose name was Giorgio. The middle-aged woman, whose name was Im, nodded. Ho-ho, said the grandmother, and toasted them with their water bottle. Quest accomplished, beamed Hadubal, and then sang, Ba-ba-ba-bam! 60 points! New objective, get your entire group to the Blue Mountains without losing anyone to dehydration, exhaustion, or wild animals. Imswitch looked irritatedly at her. The water supply had taken a beating by their heroic actions. They had about half a bottle left each. It's 3 hours hike to the next spring, if it isn't dried out, Imswitch said. Let's rest a bit. It's too hot in the middle of the day, and then we'll start walking again 2 hours from now. In the meantime, they sought refuge in the shadow of a large cactus. You couldn't lean against it, but did give shade. They waited for the shadows to grow longer. No one spoke. It was serious business, living or dying in the desert. They preserved energy and lay still, like the desert animals, except the guzzards. But Imswitch suspected that circling around up in the sky didn't take much energy. When the shadow Imswitch had been watching reached the point he had noted as far enough, he rose and shouldered his backpack, despite the heat barely being perceptibly cooler than before. We have to go now, he said. If the next water is dried up, we'll still have time to reach the river further on if we go now. The others quietly shouldered their packs and set off after him. Along the path that continued to weave over dust between cacti and up towards the mountains. Hadubal patted him on the back. So far, so good. Humph, Imswitch said. They were lucky to have started early, for the next brook was indeed dry, and it wasn't until just before nightfall that they reached the river, rushing surreally through the dry landscape, clothed on both sides with a stone's throw of green. Partial success, Amoodle toned. 20 points. What can I do with my points? Imswitch rasped. Tell you later, Hadubal said. Even she was parched, though, and too parched to do anything before drinking. They all drank deeply of the slightly silty but wonderful water. As the stars came out and they sat with their hot food in the dark, Giorgio and Im started telling their story, now and then supported by a hoo-hoo from the granny and an oh boy from a double. There had been, and there was, a great farm past the mountains above them. A farm so large it was really more of a plantation. Giorgio and Im had worked, a long time ago, for a man called Fennel. Fennel paid poorly, but there was always work, and as humans are wont to security, they stayed, year after year, working early mornings and often till dark. They fell in love there, so it wasn't all bad. One day at the end of the harvest they had sat looking out over the fields of monmons and ploftrips, and Im had said, "When we get a child, we will never be able to leave. We must know that we have food then, and it will be too late to take chances." Georgios thought then about what Im had said, and in the morning he said, "Let's go." It was a big decision, but it was as if Im had been waiting for it. She didn't protest, and they packed their belongings in 2 rucksacks. It wasn't much they had to leave, and walked from hut to hut to take their leave. They didn't tell Fennel, because they didn't trust him, and he was a man with much power. Although not lawfully, he could probably force them to stay if he put his mind to it. They traveled as small dots through the large plantation until they were swallowed up by the shadow of the mountain. Or that was what it looked like, the birds circling high above. You might think they don't care, but that might not be quite true. When humans watch rabbits, or birds, or deer, it's not like we don't care. It's more like we're watching from the outside, and maybe it's the same for birds. Anyway, they had arrived at a river beyond the mountains as winter closed in. They could fish there, and there were roots that were edible and could get them through the season. As spring came, they had planted monmons and ploftrips from the seeds they had brought, and their harvest grew a little with each year. They had a son, and as he grew up, free and never knowing anything else, they would tell him stories of their lives at the great farm, and as they were positive people, the stories were full of both good and bad, as life is. And without them realizing it, their child, whose name was started thinking of the big farm as where the world began. Because, truth be told, small Oasis Farm, as the one they lived at, could be a small world. And so, a few days after turning 13, had left for the big farm, quietly, leaving only a note. His parents were distressed, but they didn't go after him. For such was the custom of their people, that it wasn't the place of another to hinder a deep-felt desire, if it didn't hurt others. Well, it did hurt the parents, but they did what they thought was right, which was nothing. But then, only months later, people started passing their oasis, coming from the big farm. They bore stories of change, bad change. Fennel had never been a kind master, but it seemed that in his old age he had passed on the running of the farm to a few men who were much worse. They beat those who didn't work hard enough, shouted at people for just taking small breaks, and walked into people's huts after hours as they pleased. As soon as they had heard this, they had decided to cross over the mountains once more in order to bring their son back. But crossing the desert before the mountains in the summer had been harder than they thought, and if Imswich hadn't come, they surely would have perished. It's hard to know what to say after someone tells you a story like that. Imswich was relieved when the Double exclaimed, "Imswich, you got yourself a quest!" He told the Double to shut up. He turned to Im and Georgios. Would you mind if we accompanied you over the mountains? Maybe we can help you, and maybe it's safer with 4 than with 2? They looked at each other and then nodded. Yes, sure. Why not? Giorgio said. Imswich nodded too. To be a part of things, and he said, Good, good. A double is a little overenthusiastic furball, but she is right in that we have nothing better to do than try to help you if we can. Georgios raised an eyebrow at this. Huh, well, it would be interesting to hear your story later too. But we are grateful for any help we can get in getting our son back. Good, good, Imswich said. Now I'm exhausted, and we'll sleep. They bade each other good night, and all started snoring and taking turns waking each other up. But before Imswich started snoring, he thought a bit about the tufty-haired spreadsheet experts back home. He thought maybe he finally had found some real good use for them.